I want to welcome everyone to this webinar on the Gender Data Outlook for 2024. I'm Krista Jones-Baptista. I'm the Executive Director at Data2X. We are a gender data alliance working on research and advocacy around the collection, production, and use of gender data for gender equality. So I'm particularly excited to be here with all of you today to be the MC and moderator for this webinar. And I'm, again, really glad to be here. Before we begin, please note that this session will be recorded. And as Sophie mentioned throughout the webinar, we really encourage you to enter questions in the chat so we can answer those or direct them to the panelists and presenters. So with that, let's get started. I welcome you once more, and I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker for opening remarks, Papa Sek, Chief Research and Data at UN Women. Papa, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Krista, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. It's really, I have to start with a special thank you to you, Krista, for graciously agreeing to moderate this webinar for us and taking the time out of your really busy schedule to engage with us through the key findings of the Gender Data Outlook. And second, thank you to all of you for making time, taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And it's really exciting to see, the large audience that we have for this discussion today, and hopefully we won't disappoint you. It's really a great pleasure to present the key findings and highlights of the Gender Data Outlook, a product that we were able to collaborate with Paris 21 for quite some time now. So I just have to start by really, again, expressing my heartfelt thanks to our colleagues and partners at Paris 21. It's really been a great collaboration. The Gender Data Outlook today that you will hear about today represents a crucial advancement in our efforts to gather and utilize gender data that can help us to support countries in strengthening their gender data systems. Whether we are talking about building a strong statistical foundation, improving data production, or ensuring that the data is accessible and effectively used. This report is definitely a great step forward in making sure that we do have essentially the data to understand how we're doing on the efforts that we've embarked on for quite some time now to improve gender data systems. I would like to also thank our colleagues who served as technical advisors, so in our technical advisory group. And, their valuable insights throughout the process have really played a crucial role in shaping and strengthening the foundations of the Gender Data Outlook. Some of the members of and their organizations have provided us with, critical data. So major data sources that were used to formulate the index, such as, the UN Statistics Division, for example, and the Global Survey on Gender Data, Open Data Watch on, the data coming from the Compass, but also, the qualitative assessment of the 58 data use cases, from partners such as UNFPA and others. So we're really fortunate to have some of these experts joining us today in the panel, and I'm really grateful to them. So, I won't give away any of the surprises of the index, but it's really important to highlight two key points. First, the Gender Data Outlook is a significant piece of work. It not only sheds light on critical areas, but also identifies where we can make meaningful interventions and basically, what is it that we can do to effect change. The interventions that have potential to be successful because of the insights coming from the Gender Data Outlook are directly, essentially, coming from data sourced directly from countries. So what the index that you will hear about shortly tells us is really, I think, countries' own view of themselves. So this is really, again, data coming from national statistical systems. So it's really an introspective data set, and that's really, I think, really important to highlight, because this is again what countries see as their strengths and weaknesses. Second, the index is also a valuable tool for advocacy and resource mobilization, but also a powerful means to engage in meaningful conversations with country counterparts to again advocate for necessary interventions, but also look at concretely basically what can be done. So because now I think we've lacked this information for quite some time. And I'm really excited that we finally now have this data, and we can really, again, have be more surgical in our interventions. So we may not have all the answers to produce a perfect measure for gender data capacity, but I think these efforts are definitely in the right direction. And it's not just the index; it's also about the use cases, and a lot that we are learning from those. So again, our teams are really keen to present the results, and we look forward to hearing also your valuable feedback and insights on how we together can work to advance this agenda. So once again, welcome to and thank you to all of you for being part of this important conversation on gender data. Over to you, Krista. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Papa, for those opening remarks. And now we'll dive into some of the key findings. We're going to hear from 3 presenters next. Emma Saman, the lead consultant on this initiative, Sophie Kennelly from Paris 21, and Jessamine Encarnacion from UN Women. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Krista. Would you share the slides, please, Sophie?
Excuse me while I just share those. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. Perfect. If you could, yeah, skip down 2, please. And yeah, two more.
How's that looking, Emma?
No, I'm still on the title page, Sophie. If you could skip to slide 3.
I'm on slide 3. Let me stop sharing and share again. How about that, Emma?
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so thanks again. First of all, what I would like to do is to introduce the Gender Data Outlook Index, which is a new summary measure of gender data capacity. The index currently includes 3 key dimensions. The first dimension, the enabling environment, is measuring laws and regulations, National Statistics Office staffing for gender statistics, coordination within the wider statistical system, and budgetary support. The second, data production, is capturing countries' capacity to collect and process gender data for national agendas and for SDG reporting. And then the third dimension, data accessibility, is focusing on the extent to which national statistics offices are making gender data open, disseminating it in user-friendly ways, and partnering with outside stakeholders in order to make sure that data are fit for purpose. And then there's a fourth critical element of gender data capacity, data use, which isn't yet included in the index owing to a lack of reliable data, but that will be the subject of the next presentation. The index itself combines 16 indicators. All of the data is either for 2022 or 2023. And for the details of construction, you can refer to the methodology note, which is also being released today. Next slide, please, Sophie. And based on the index, what I'd like to do is to talk about findings, highlight three of the areas that the outlook is addressing. So the first area relates to country performance. The index itself ranges from 0 to 1. The average score across the 83 countries it includes is 0.53, or just over half of what's possible. But the point that I'd like to stress here is the diversity of country experiences. So we see that scores range from just over 0.8 at the top of the distribution in Philippines and Mexico to around 0.2 or lower at the other extreme. And additionally, both the top and the bottom performers come from several geographic regions and from all four income groups. So Uganda, for example, stands out as a low-income country that is amongst our top performers. Next slide, please, Sophie. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the next point I'd like to speak to is our analysis of the index and its components, which gives us some insights as to where improvements may be needed. So if we look at the dimensions of the index, on average, we see performance is highest for data production, followed by the enabling environment, with accessibility lagging. But then in some countries, you can see here, Azerbaijan and Chile, for example, performance is well balanced across the dimensions, while in others, it's much more uneven. So this type of exercise begins to tell us where interventions might be needed in particular contexts. Then if we look at the indicators, we have a more granular view still. In some lower capacity countries, for example, we find that improvements in securing regular funding and dedicated staffing for gender statistics typically are needed. Whereas in countries with relatively higher capacity, there are often gaps in coordination within the national statistical system. For example, in collaboration with the gender machinery and user-producer dialogues. Next slide, please, Sophie.
Emma and Sophie, if I could ask, participants are asking if we could make the slides full screen mode.
I'm sorry, that's my fault. I realized I have to stop sharing to start again. But thank you, Krista. You've given me the excuse to do so.
Pause. Yes, we'll be right back.
Wonderful, thank you. So
here we go.
The next point I wanted to underscore is the importance of sustained financing from both domestic and external sources. We see that countries that have regular budgets for gender statistics are performing better on most other elements of gender data capacity. For example, their average data accessibility score is around 60% higher than that of countries that don't have such budgets. And our study also finds ample scope for many development partners to increase their funding for gender statistics. So as you can see here, fully half of OECD Development Assistance Committee members devoted either zero or a negligible amount of their statistics ODA to gender data activities. Next slide, please, Sophie. And last but not least, I wanted to emphasize that overall statistical capacity doesn't necessarily translate into gender data capacity. So we compare our index with the World Bank's Statistical Performance Index, which is a composite measure of overall statistical capacity. We can see that the two measures are broadly related. This is particularly true for countries at lower capacity levels. But what's also notable is that in several countries, including lower income countries such as Benin, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, amongst others, the gender data capacity is higher than their overall statistical capacity might predict. And this reinforces our argument that at all income levels, it's possible for countries to prioritize their gender data capacity. And so I'll stop now, and Sophie will speak to data use, which, as mentioned, is the fourth critical dimension of our gender data capacity framework. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, I'm going to talk, as Emma suggested, about the analysis of 58 use cases of gender data from over 30 different countries. So I'm going to base it on a couple of quotes from the main report. So I hope they make sense. Do feel free to post any questions if not. So firstly, gender data are likely undervalued in their potential to support gender equality and women's empowerment. Across the 58 cases that we analysed, the Gender Data Outlook identified examples of 10 distinct purposes of gender data use, highlighting that gender data can contribute to gender equality in quite a wide range of different ways. Yet the number of cases used for just 2 purposes, policy development and program design, far outweighed those used for other purposes. Of course, this could reflect priorities, expectations, and biases in how gender data is used or how use is reported. But it also points towards how gender data is perhaps undervalued in how it can be used to support gender equality. For example, why isn't gender data use prioritized for advocacy, budgeting, or resource mobilization? The second point is that the sheer availability of gender data simply isn't enough to ensure that gender data is taken up and used. So what we're finding is that on the one hand, gender data availability is fairly high across a wide range of issue areas and sectors, from employment and education to demography and population statistics. Yet use appears more concentrated in priority areas for gender equality and women's empowerment. So we have a lot of examples of use in areas such as violence against women and unpaid domestic care work. Of course, the good news is that this means that there are more opportunities for more and more diverse gender data use. The data is there to be taken up. But on the other hand, it does point towards the fact that simply having the data or producing the data isn't enough to ensure that it actually translates to advancing gender equality. Capacity development is needed across dimensions, so beyond production, to ensure that gender data use is increased across sectors and among different users. Thirdly, how gender data are communicated may not only influence if they are used, but also how, by whom, and for what purpose. So of course, different potential users have different priorities, needs, and preferences when it comes to receiving or searching for gender data. So while users with higher levels of data literacy, such as researchers, may prefer tabular data so that they can perform their own analysis, users with perhaps less time, such as a lot of policymakers, or lower levels of data literacy, like much of the public, will need easy to access, easy to understand formats of gender data, such as infographics. So what this means, of course, in order to reach diversity in who is using gender data and how is it used, we also need to diversify how it's disseminated. And such diversity is currently not commonplace among national statistical offices, who typically just have one or even no product dedicated to disseminating gender data. And finally, there is often an assumption that gender data are the concern of national statistical offices, and that gender issues are solely the concern of women's machinery. So in almost all cases that we analysed, successful gender data uptake and use built on cooperation and engagement across at least 2 stakeholder groups. There were, of course, prevalent forms of cooperation, so in particular between women's machinery and the National Statistical Office, or between development partners and the National Statistical Office. Cooperation did also go far beyond this to financial institutions, private companies, civil society, and parliamentarians. So what this means when it comes to capacity, we've seen that in order to use gender data, you need a range of different skills and capacities that go across those different dimensions that are presented. And actually a very efficient way to ensure that this capacity is there is to pull together those skills through collaboration and partnerships. So I think that's all from me on the use, but I'm happy to pass over to Jessa then for the key takeaways.
Yeah.
Jessa, over.
Thank you, Emma and Sophie, for sharing the insightful findings of the Gender Data Outlook. Your presentations highlight the varying gender data capacities across countries, as well as the diverse, impactful uses of gender data. As we reflect on the broader implications, I'd like to emphasize the key takeaways that can help us better leverage gender data to drive meaningful progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment. Yes, so first and foremost, it is crucial to recognize that strengthening gender data systems requires a holistic and comprehensive approach. It's not just about generating more gender data, it's about building robust institutional and budgetary support. It's about ensuring data accessibility, and most importantly, making sure that data is actually used. This means investing in capacity building across all dimensions of gender data capacity, because this is where real change begins. Without this comprehensive approach, we risk falling short of our goals. Secondly, we cannot overstate the importance of sustainable domestic and external funding. Securing reliable funding is absolutely essential. To truly harness the power of gender data, we need resources, not just for producing the data, but for ensuring that its effective use. This includes dissemination efforts, developing strong statistical laws and action plans, forming advisory groups, fostering ongoing dialogues between users as well as producers. And without adequate funding, we simply cannot unlock the full potential of gender data to promote gender equality. Third, it is time to broaden horizons when it comes to how gender data is used. The GDO introduces a novel typology that encourages us to think beyond the usual applications in policy and program design. We should be using gender data in diverse ways to drive change and prioritize our investments strategically. This new typology is more than just a framework. It is a push to be more innovative and expansive in how we think about and apply gender data. Fourth, a clear intent to use from the very beginning is essential. Improving gender data capacity isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It must be tailored to each country's unique needs and context, especially where there are gaps. Intentionality is key to building gender data capacity. I'm sure we all agree on this. Having an intent to use isn't just a box to check. It is a fundamental principle to ensure that data we produce actually drives decision-making and change. And lastly, let's not forget the power of partnerships and effective communication. The real impact of gender data comes from how it is used, and that almost always relies on strong partnerships. We need collaboration across the board: government agencies, civil society, research institutions, private sector. All of these stakeholders play a crucial role. And the way we communicate this data, that's what determines who it reaches and how it is used. We need to be innovative, inclusive, and targeted in our communication efforts to make sure gender data reaches the right hands and drives the change we all want to see. Thank you, and over to you, Krista.
Thank you so much, Jessa, Emma, and Sophie, for those remarks and insights into the gender data outlook. I want to encourage you again to put your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And also, if you want to introduce yourself and let us know that you're here, some of you have started to do that. Please continue that and let us know that you're here. We're going to shift now to the panel following on the presentation around the Gender Data Outlook. And we have 4 wonderful presenters and speakers that we'll hear from in the next part of this webinar. I'm going to introduce them all, and then we'll do a round robin of questions. First, Piedad Urlinola, Director of DANE, the National Statistics Office of Colombia. Diva Dar, Deputy Director, Women's Economic Empowerment, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Lorenz Noe, Research Manager at Open Data Watch. And Umar Sarajuddin, Manager at the Development Data Group at the World Bank. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with Piedad. The Gender Data Outlook found that Colombia is one of the top performers in gender data production, accessibility, and especially in creating strong institutional foundations that enable greater data production and use. What do you think are the main factors behind your success in building a strong gender data system?
Thank you, Krista, for the introduction and for the question. Well, there's no short answer to this question, but if I had to do it, it's the teamwork. It's not only accredited to DANE. The construction of a strong national gender data system, as by definition, its scope defines, requires the collaboration among different stakeholders, ranging from users, producers, and enablers. So to go into details, I would like to take upon key pillars, which we have constructed a data ecosystem, which is sensitive to gender mainstream. So first of all, we have institutional commitment. That's something that is absolutely required. The willingness to take action and the recognition of our role lead to the creation of differential and intersectional approach unit at DANE since 2015, almost 10 years ago, in accordance to the Beijing platform, helping to build an expert body in charge of advancing in matter regarding gender mainstream in official statistics. And as I said, partnership. Our willingness to take action would have been ignored if we had not benefited from a series of frontrunners and committed institutions, people, researchers, academia, and of course, users, which allow it to increase our expertise on the matter. So is this environment what has allowed us to make significant progress on the issuance of a solid regulatory framework as well? It is now enshrined in an updated law of official statistics, which recognizes the priority status of the production of gender disaggregated data, setting an obligation to generate gender disaggregated data and promote its use for policymaking. Moreover, it has allowed us to use these guidelines, these gender guidelines that I just mentioned a few moments ago, to strengthen the production of gender statistics, not only in DANE, not only in the institution, but also across the national statistical system. Thus, it creates these circles that benefits everyone else and also ensures our leadership and willingness that has never been centered exclusively in the NSOs. So as you might be aware, a key milestone was the publication of this guide for the inclusion of the differential and intersectional approach in the statistical production of the national statistical system, which is now under a process of update, taking into account new concepts and current regulations regarding the main differential approaches: gender, ethnic and racial, peasantry, disability, and life cycle. So those additional elements to highlight at this point, not only as enablers for our progress so far, but as catalyzers and safeguards for the road ahead. Focus on sustainability. DANE has implemented mechanisms that guarantee the sustainability of gender data production by ensuring that these efforts do not depend exclusively on temporary projects or funding, but are integrated into the structural operations for the institution and are part of the entity's knowledge management cycle. Interinstitutional collaboration. So we are very well known for always being collaborating with different actors that all are producers and users. Working with institutions such as ECLAC or UN Women has been crucial as well. Partnership with academia. For DANE, it's essential to generate collaborative relationships with different actors in the system, based on the understanding that multidisciplinary makes it possible to successfully contribute to the production of quality and reliable statistics. And finally, innovation and capacity building. DANE constantly encourages the updating and adoption of new ways of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating gender data. And finally, I'd like to take the opportunity as a host for the 5th UN World Data Forum to take advantage of this opportunity to encourage you to register and join us in Medellin in the incoming November 12 to 15, which is the perfect setting to continue these conversations and advance in the construction of the updated framework, which help us all to highlight the value of data in terms of innovation, data use for decision-making, trust, and partnership. Within this framework, benefiting from the lessons learned and findings of the Gender Data Outlook of 2024 will help us to ground the conversation and help to continue in the positioning of gender data in our priorities.
Thank you so much, Piedad, for highlighting the elements that have been so critical to Colombia's success and also for bringing up the UN World Data Forum. We're going to shift now to Diva. Diva, the Gender Data Outlook highlights that countries with a regular budget on gender data perform significantly better in gender data capacity than those without. As a longstanding investor in supporting countries to scale up data-driven impact, from your perspective, what are the steps needed to increase sustainable domestic and international financing to strengthen gender data systems?
Thanks, Krista. I think it's a really important question. And I think there are a few other facts that the report sheds light on, which I think are useful to highlight, and previous work as well done by Data2X and Open Data Watch and Paris 21. So for example, we already know there are a number of donors who are giving ODA to statistics who are not necessarily allocating funding specifically to gender statistics, and that's something that's highlighted by this report. The other fact that we know is gender data systems are severely underfunded. As some of your work has shown, there's a sort of shortage of $450 million per year, which is approximately only half of what is needed to actually fully support the kind of gender data we need for decision-making and policy-making for accelerating gender equality. And the last fact is that the pool of development partners who are supporting gender data funding is actually a very narrow base, with about 10 donors accounting for 70% of the funding until very recently. So the report and these other facts highlight the need for really diversifying the base of gender data funding that is going to be required. And not only does this mean that we have to continue with the drumbeat at the World Data Forum at key moments, as partners like you, Open Data Watch, Paris 21, UN Women are doing, but really increase global stakeholder coordination and collaboration to harness these new resources that will be leveraged to ensure that the advocacy and momentum with the Committed Data Initiative, the Power of Data High Impact Initiative, all of these actually translate into commitments, especially from governments as well, to more routine funding for gender statistics. The second piece I think that is going to be really important, as you were saying, there are obviously people who are contributing loans and grants and facilities for statistics, and gender needs to be embedded. At this day and age, we should not need to make the argument or the case for why it's important for gender to be embedded into these broader initiatives. But I think that is still a case we have to make, whether it's with the World Bank, whether it's with donors, to ensure that the funding is going towards key things and it's wrapped into broader statistical support and funding that is going out. And finally, I think an important resource to tap into, of course, is country-driven resource mobilization itself. So decision makers for funding at a domestic level are going to be key for the majority of funding that's going to be required in developing countries. And that buy-in from policymakers, whether it's national statistical offices, ministries of finance, is going to be key for the kind of sustainable funding that we are seeking for gender data. A lot of good work has been done by partners to make those use cases, to show how critical data has been into feeding into policymaking. UN Women, for example, has done some excellent work on ensuring that time use survey data is feeding into the national care policy work with a group of other stakeholders, both locally and globally, to ensure that data is being used. And that's something that I think has to become routine, not a one-off, but systematically embedded into all our efforts so that these are not cases that need to be made but are appreciated and ultimately owned by governments and countries themselves in resource-constrained environments. So those are the three things that I feel we need to do as a community, but I really look forward to hearing ideas from others as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Diva, for laying that out for us and giving us that perspective. And I will encourage everyone to put your comments and questions in the chat as well. I'm going to keep saying that. Next, we're going to go to Lorenz. Challenges in accessing gender data has often been raised as a key stumbling block towards promoting its effective use in policies and programs. Some of the things we've been hearing about. The Gender Data Outlook reinforces this critical message, which found that across countries, data accessibility is the weakest of the three dimensions assessed in the index, and available data isn't always used. What steps or strategies can be implemented from your perspective to improve data openness and encourage gender data uptake and use?
Thanks, Krista, and thanks to UN Women and Press 21 for hosting this webinar, inviting Open Data Watch as well. And a special hello from our Managing Director, Shweta Bedi, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. And congrats on this great new product. We really look forward to supporting it, using it ourselves in our work, and seeing it used by this wide community to inform better gender data production and use. To your question, we know from our own work on the Gender Data Compass that not only is gender data accessibility low, as the Outlook has also shown, but it's also less open and therefore less usable, also compared to other sources of data and development data in particular. And this obviously has negative implications for using gender data to inform policymaking for greater gender equality. According to kind of our studies, this is often because gender data remains siloed in their dissemination and, for example, are only featured as standalone publications in things like gender equality yearbooks. These products are a really good start for disseminating gender data, but they can't be the full extent to how gender data are published because this siloed dissemination approach oftentimes also reflects a siloed approach to gender data production as well, which means that also as long as they're siloed, gender data production will kind of continue to be additional rather than kind of a core cross-cutting component of data systems. And it's great to hear kind of these from examples that we've heard from of where that is being embedded across the board. So that's kind of one of the main strategies that we see for also improving data openness and to encourage uptake and use, which is that we want to see and encourage countries to pursue holistic and build inclusive, gender-sensitive gender data systems from beginning to end of the data value chain, really. And this entails mainstreaming of gender data in all publications where it's relevant to ensure more sustainable production and dissemination of gender data, which again is part of that virtuous cycle we're trying to build with greater use and uptake, which will then lead to better use in policy and better results for gender equality. Such a system, such a mainstreaming for both production and dissemination is often supported by statistical laws. I know that someone mentioned that in the chat, for example, and a system-wide emphasis on gender data. For example, in the gender machinery that was mentioned by Sophie, these signals from elsewhere in the NSS, not just from the NSO, can kind of act as the own internal demand signal by linking gender equality policies to national sets of gender data that are required for monitoring, for example. And it also entails expanding capacity efforts and training for gender data to include issues of data interoperability, integration, and dissemination. These kinds of activities are also oftentimes can be supported by, again, these cross-cutting plans, which we see in a couple of countries, for example. One that, for example, haven't been mentioned yet, were in Kenya, Ghana, and Dominican Republic, which all have gender sector statistics plans, for example, as well. There's also, aside from this holistic component that I've talked about so far, there's also the kind of more technical component, which really applies to all data systems, and again, is a big part of our work, openness with the open data inventory. As Sophie mentioned, different users need different data in different formats to enable their use. And for example, machine readable and non-proprietary files, meaning you don't need a paid license to use the format, is a big part of that, making data available with more download options, and adding more metadata, especially in the age of AI, where there's really a big need to ensure that data are properly tagged, that they can be explained both to users as well as to algorithms, at the bare minimum with where they're from, what the definitions are, and when, for example, data were last updated, to ensure kind of the proper timing of representing the proper time. And finally, adopting an open license is one that kind of just reflects a simple disclaimer on a website, but obviously can have larger legal implications for ensuring that publication of data is in line with rules regarding publishing data openly that's produced by official sources. So in sum, we see kind of these strategies for better data as gender data accessibility really going into two buckets, one on the enabling environment and one on the more technical components. And again, while a lot of these have obviously capacity constraints potentially for countries, as Emma mentioned in her presentation, we really see kind of steps that every country, no matter kind of the income, can take to improve those dissemination practices and improve gender data openness. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for some really practical kind of reflections and thoughts on what we can be thinking about here. Next, I'm going to go to Umar. As we've heard, the Gender Data Outlook aims to help provide greater insights around countries' gender data capacities. The report found that countries with strong overall statistical capacity doesn't always lead to strong gender data capacity, as shown with the comparison between the World Bank's Statistical Performance Index. What actions can be taken to help close this gap?
Thank you, Krista, for giving me the floor, and I'll just take 1 minute to wax lyrical about the work. So really, congratulations on this massive effort. It brings us all in the same page. It helps benchmark progress, and it can help move policy. So, and you have developed a framework that covers all aspects of statistical capacity. And in that sense, it is akin to the World Bank's statistical performance indicators. And what I really appreciated was that you also focus on data use and measuring, which actually bedevils us, right? But you focus on data use and outside of the NSO. So really, this is a massive effort, and hearty congratulations. Now, we have been listening about the diversity of country experiences, right? And from that, we see that income isn't destiny. And that's kind of actually a hopeful message, right? Because other things like human capital, governance, how you prioritize data, all of those things matter for performance. So earlier we heard from Piedad of DANE, and just did some calculations. So Colombia has a GDP per capita of around $7,000 US, but on its overall statistical capacity as measured by the SPI, it performs at countries with 3 times that GDP per capita level. And its GDO score is also equally high. So clearly an overperformer, and we have several of these. On the flip side, there are underperformers also, right? And that's what you are mentioning. And so what do we do about it? And clearly, all of us have agree on the need for sustained financing and purposive work on this issue. But I'll also take some additional tax on that, because focusing on fundamental reform of the overall system, I mean, it is a must, but this also can take time. But we don't really need to wait for that to happen to improve gender data. So the bank, the World Bank has an active portfolio. In the last 5 years, we have $2 billion devoted to statistical capacity building, and it goes to 40 IDA countries. Now, and all of these also have gender components, but we also see sometimes there are just some initiatives that can have, that are tagged along with this that can have catalytic effects. So we also have I'll use an example of the Strengthening Gender Statistics Program, which is actually funded by the Gates Foundation, the SGS. And this leverages the World Bank's existing investments in statistical systems. And it works with local stakeholders, NSOs and beyond, to bring forth data in a gender-informed way. And we don't focus on high SPI countries for the SGS. In fact, we go to countries with low capacity and try to improve their gender statistics by providing technical assistance on data production, data analysis, and dissemination. And the technical assistance includes assessments of gender gaps, recommendations for survey questionnaires, capacity building to train on how to produce statistics, and support in disseminating data. And all this happens while the broader work of improving the statistical system goes on. And it's not also just a country level agenda, it's a global agenda as well. So we know that the coverage of the 50 gender-related indicators in the SDGs is low. It's about a third of the countries report on it, about half of the incidents for other SDGs. So here, of course, the NSOs, international agencies, we need to do a better job in data production, but there are also some low-hanging fruits. So there is a recent paper that Kathleen Beagle and Brian Stacey, Divyanshi Wadhwa, and I authored, where we show that despite established methodologies, underreporting remains a big issue. So addressing this doesn't require significant investments, right? But more improved processes and greater effort. So the upshot of what I'm trying to say is that we can start working on improving gender data today. There is no need to wait while we also work on the overall system. So really, again, thank you for this massive effort. You have laid the foundation, and it'll be a big contribution.
Thank you so much, Umar. And I want to add my congratulations to the team for the launch of the Gender Data Outlook. One of the things that strikes me about this conversation so far is, and I'm really curious about how we can build on some of the calls to develop more of a knowledge base. I'm so impressed by the 58 case studies, and I think there's probably a lot of rich material there that we can continue to draw on in terms of the pieces of the puzzle, a blueprint for how to apply some of these proven practices in countries that aren't quite there yet. How do we connect the overperformers, as Umar mentioned, with those that might be not where we would expect them to be, and build those bridges in collaboration with one another and with sort of the financing that we have as we advocate for additional financing and additional financing models and methods at the country level. I also really appreciated the ways that so far we've heard about how to communicate data in new ways and to different types of stakeholders. I think that's something that sometimes gets doesn't get as much of a focus, and so I'm really grateful that that was brought up in this conversation, and then translating that into the advocacy pieces that we can use with our own organizations, but really maybe begin to think about how do we again build a knowledge base there around what works in the advocacy space at the national level, at the country level, and the regional level, and how we can be smarter and more thoughtful and more engaging on those pieces to have the impact that we want to have at the end of the day. So just really delighted to be part of this conversation. I also think we're really at a great moment, and it's it's great that the World Data Forum has come up because we can continue this conversation throughout the fall leading up to that key event where there is some momentum around collaboration across stakeholders through the Power of Data, through the Commitments campaign, where we are putting forward some collective commitments on coordinating across gender tools, as well as beginning to think about data, gender data for the next, for future phases beyond 2030. So really looking forward to that, to the session on this, the Gender Data Outlook that will take place at the World Data Forum, and then the Commit to Data campaign overall that I know many of us are involved in. And if you aren't, we can definitely share more information on that as well and get you engaged. So we have some time for questions from the audience. I am going to ask those questions. So first, there's a question from, and thank you to those of you who put your questions in the chat. You still have time, so please do so. We have a question from Diana Castillo Trejo. It's been noted that in general, not enough resources are dedicated to gender statistics. For small NSOs, National Statistical Offices, and small countries where resource constraints are even more pronounced, what are key areas that we can focus our efforts on to achieve improvements with respect to production, dissemination, and use of gender data? That may be most appropriate for Piedad to begin, but then others can weigh in as well. And we'll take a few questions, but let's start with that one.
Thank you for Diana for this question. Well, first, let's keep in mind why are we doing this? Because equity is important. Otherwise, we will be living in these societies that inequality that's good for no one. It impacts the entire society. Those that are pushed down and those that have promoted to be pushed up. So we need first visibility. So we could start, or any NSO could start with those statistics that are already produced, that are already established and needed and visible, and that are taken by almost everyone. In terms of gender, labor market's one of those. So unemployment rates, participation rates, occupational rates by gender is the opening door. It's like it's already done. Is already produced, most countries do it, and you can present the gender gap. So what is already done is that it is produced, but the gender gap is not shown. So it's just giving visibility to the things that we have already done. And that shows, and it has a great impact because in the labor market is one of those pieces where gender differences are huge. And what's behind, what happens behind those statistics are related to gender division of roles. So it's usually unpaid domestic work, which is behind those gaps in the labor market. So that will cut the eye in the people that is reading these, that are reading these numbers, and then it will advance to other measures like that, like those of unpaid domestic work, by any other way of measuring it. So starting with something that is already established is a good idea. Vital statistics as well. Mortality, fertility, by gender, those clear statistics that are already done, established, that common people outside can read it easily, and you can show the gender gap. So we can start with those that are already established and then move forward to other ones. And I have to apologize because I have to go. I have another meeting. So this is wonderful. Congratulations. And thank you very much for having me here. This is a great conversation, and I hope we can expand these conversations during the World Data Forum in Medellin this incoming November.
Thank you so much, Piedad, for joining us. Thanks for your
Thank
time.
you. Bye.
Bye. Did any of the other speakers have anything to add on that question? Yes, Emma.
Yeah, I would add just a small point as well, which is that in constructing the index, I wanted to be clear that we're not looking at the amounts of funding which are dedicated to gender statistics. We're looking at whether there is a regular commitment in the national budget for statistics towards gender statistics. So just to make excuse me, it may not be necessarily amounts per se, but more of a concentrated focus on gender data that is important, independently of the actual amount, which is devoted to gender statistics.
Great, thank you. There's the next question that I'm going to ask the report organization, so UN Women Paris 21, to answer, which is from Camilo Mendez. How can the outcomes of the Gender Data Outlook have an impact on decision-making for MDBs and resource allocation by UN Development System institutions?
Thank you, Chris. I don't know, Jess, if you want to start here, or if we should speak as well from Paris 21.
Yeah, you can have a go, Sophie, and then I'll follow.
Great, thank you. Well, I think maybe I'll speak more to the first question about how the outcomes can have an impact on decision-making for development banks. And I think really this comes down to something that came up, I think, in Jess's key takeaways, and that's about making more targeted investments and understanding that what one country needs isn't necessarily where we need to be focusing for all countries. So I hope that the full report in particular, but as well the highlights, will start to shed some light on how to make more intelligent investments in that regard. And I think maybe just to finish on that point about looking beyond production. So I think we're sort of at that point where we still need investments in production, we still need to increase availability, but really looking a bit further about the actual objective of gender data at all, and how to ensure that the investments also ensure that gender data translates to advancements for women and girls as well. So Jess, I will hand over to you as well on this point.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. I think for this, just 3 points quickly. First, I think this framework, the GDO framework, really underscored the value of gender data use, particularly. And the typology has likewise underscored that. And I think the takeaway from here in terms of support to countries is really to make sure that any support comes with, like, intentionality of use. That it's not like, as I mentioned, it's not like automatic that when we produce and make data available, it's actually used. So I think that's also the fundamental principle that will always have to be asked and in terms of interventions and support. Now, second would be really, as mentioned by Sophie and likewise articulated in the findings shared by Emma, the targeted approach, that it's not one size fits all. Like, we have to ensure that where countries' areas for improvement is where investments are needed strategically. Now, third, it's also the funding. I think it's not just the funding provided for support for external, but I think also underscoring the findings in this report, domestic funding for sustainability, not just for sustainability, but also strengthening their gender data systems really matter. That we've seen that when there is regular budget for gender data, but we don't have the actual, it's just presence or not of regular budget, it increases data accessibility, capacity for data accessibility by 60%. It increases capacity for data production by 30%. So it's that domestic funding particularly also underscores that point. So I think it's a combination of all these things. Over.
Thanks, Jessa. Lawrence, I'll turn to you to answer the question on social media.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to take on the question of whether social media can be considered as an effective tool for an NSO to increase gender data uptake and use. So in our work with the Open Data Inventory, we oftentimes find that we kind of take a user perspective to how we discover the data that NSOs publish. And so oftentimes social media sites are in fact sort of a useful entry point for finding the data. So we definitely encourage NSOs to sort of meet the users where they are and make sure that they offer, again, different users with different levels of statistical literacy to be able to find the data. Although we do want to emphasize that all of these, wherever these data are published, whether it's on these social media sites, that one should always be able to kind of find their way back to what for most countries is sort of a central database, where again, data are properly explained, tagged, and can be further downloaded and used. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Last question for the panelists. I believe this is for Emma or Sophie or Jessa, which is from Dennis Njunge for the team. I'd like to hear more on the disparities between data statistical capacities and gender data capacities amongst actors. Was this as widespread amongst countries, or was it in selective cases? So anything you can expand on there briefly?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first on that. So we looked at this there's 81 of our 83 countries had both World Bank SPI data and our own index. So we looked at the relationship amongst a broad number of countries. And I think there's two things there that I'll highlight. The first is, yes, there's a moderate relationship between the two indicators. We see that it's particularly strong for countries at lower capacities, which suggests that maybe at lower levels of statistical capacity, some foundational basic investments in statistical capacity might be translating into gender data capacity. We see that as capacity increases, the relationship becomes a little bit more diffuse, which we interpret as meaning that more specialized gender-focused investments might be needed at higher levels of capacity, where gender data capacity is perhaps lagging behind overall statistical capacity. And conversely, as mentioned, there's some countries where gender data capacity seems to be outstripping statistical capacity. I don't know if maybe Umar has other thoughts on that. But yeah, I would say that we definitely see a moderate relationship, particularly lower capacity countries, less so at higher capacity countries. And I think it has particular implications depending on what the relationship is for the country in question.
Okay. Umar, did you want to come in on that one?
No, just to reinforce what Emma said, I think when your capacity is higher, then it's really a matter of intention and commitment, right? Whereas if your capacity is lower, then just more systemic change is needed.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for your questions. We're at the lightning round for our panelists now. Please keep your answers to 1 minute or less. I'm going to ask each of you the same question, which is, how can the Gender Data Outlook and its findings be used in your work to advance gender data efforts? We're going to go in backwards order. So Umar, then Lawrence, and then Diva.
So this work is really particularly meaningful for the bank and for our gender agenda. And as I mentioned earlier, that we do have large statistical capacity building programs, right? $2 billion committed in the last 5 years across 40 countries. And we see that the statistical performance index that we have developed is used there as a results indicator to track progress. But more than that, actually, it has also informed project design. So for example, in Africa, there was an 11-country regional project on statistical capacity building, and the team used the SPI to frame the project. And we also see similarly the SGS that I mentioned earlier, strengthening gender statistics, being used in a similar way. And these things actually make their way into the country partnership frameworks or our country climate and development reports. And I can envisage the GDO being another tool in our arsenal and being extremely useful. So we are a data-hungry organization, and this is what you need for data-driven policymaking.
Thank you, Umar. Lawrence, over to you.
Thanks. I wanted to highlight, I think the contribution that the GDO also makes, and it's been mentioned already a little bit by some other panelists too, around, again, spurring further development around and thinking around how to develop more sort of use cases for gender data, specifically the typology that's been developed for these gender data use cases. I think does a huge service to the field for again driving the conversation forward in terms of how the different ways that data use can be classified and begin to be measured. This is something that obviously all of us in the community have worked on and tried to make progress on. And so this is, I think, really a good step forward. These data use stories, I'm sure, are not the only ones out in the world. And so I think continuous work to also increase the corpus of these data use stories, I think can only kind of lead to a better typology moving forward, which again, I think then will further lead to better ways that we can link these use cases back to kind of catalytic activities around gender data production and uses, and then also catalytic investments for that use case. So I think that'll all really help to again firm up the knowledge base for basically the whole gender data value chain. So that's what I'm particularly excited about and hoping to use more of in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Diva.
Thanks. I think a lot of really useful implications have already been discussed. So the funding and the resource mobilization learnings that come out of this, as well as some of the implications on embedding gender where there's already statistical capacity and vice versa, places where we need to build statistical capacity alongside the gender intentionality hand in hand, I think are both important learnings. But I think the other thing that we learned is where to focus. So I think the framework, by breaking down some of the production enabling environment and accessibility separately, also tells us where there are opportunities to better target and tailor the kind of support that donors and partners, implementing partners, and even advocates are providing to countries. So to give an example, the index classifies India as a country with sort of lower middle statistical data capacity, but accessibility is the one area which is ranked the lowest. And I think tailoring the approach to a strategy where instead of sort of blanket support, where there's really more of an approach on actually improving data access and accessibility is going to be important as we make more smarter and targeted investments. Given the resource constraints we just discussed, are going to be important to help shift and get countries to where they need to be.
Great, thank you. I want to take a minute to thank all of the panelists and presenters one more time. And it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you. Now I'm going to turn to Johannes Jutting, the Executive Director at Paris 21, for our closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, I'm really amazed, and thank you so much to all of you who contributed, and all of you, I mean, Krista, for moderating the session, for the speakers, for my own team, for the UN Women team. It has been a long journey, an exciting journey to get to the stage where we are. And seeing the level of participation of the colleagues here in the chat, I mean, there were 150 people, many stayed on. If you look at the questions, it's a really, really exciting and engaging community. And I really wanted to thank everybody for being part of this journey. It's difficult to, after such a debate, to add anything meaningful. So let me step back a little bit. Maybe 2 points. One is really, this is just the beginning of showcasing some of the exciting results of this work. And this work includes also many of the work that we are referencing from the partners. So it's just not UN Women Paris 21. It's also work done by the World Bank, by Open Data Watch, by Data2X, and by UN Statistical Division. So it's a really collective effort to bring to the attention to the development people beyond the statistical capacity and data people this important topic. And I think I have learned so much. And while we were working, it was not always every day so easy, but I have to say the sum of the parts are more than the individual parts, I have to say. So just only to tell you, we have more documents available for you. We have a highlight document that was produced specifically for today, which is available on both websites of UN Women and Paris 21, which you can download and which you can go to. There are working papers, there are technical papers that are available explaining the framework and the GDO index. And I couldn't agree more. And thank you so much, Uma, for your kind words. It's a super massive effort to compile all that data and to put it into an index and make some meaningful results. And also the framework. It's really adding value beyond what has been there out before. And the most exciting things, the report itself, it's still to come. As we have said, it will be published at the World Data Forum, will be available. So you will be able to see the whole report. You will be able to look for countries. You will be able to drive really deep down and look what you are interested in. So that was one thing. The second thing is, if we step back, when we started this work, and it's good, I can see Papa, so I can see his reaction, but I think he would agree with me. The question was for many people in this field, do we need another index? Do we need another report? I mean, there are many things out there which are very, very good, and they have been mentioned. But I have to tell you, after 1.5 years or so working on it, I think it was worthwhile the effort. I think we have learned more things now than we wouldn't be able to tell you a year ago. And many of you have said those things. Let me pick just two from my perspective. From a country perspective, and being a development economist, often we say, okay, first development, then we think about gender equality and gender data capacity. The good news is, and I think we should say it in simple words, even poor countries, low resource countries can improve gender data capacity at a very early stage of their development. And I think that's something really to look into eventually even more in detail. There were some very good questions of how this can be done, where they can focus on communication efforts, making that data use, social media and whatnot. So I think there is some scope for, even at a low income level, to do something for gender data capacity. Bearing in mind, of course, what Uma has said and many others echoing, we need to have at that level often fundamental, so that strengthening the system at large. But still there is possibilities. I think that's really good. So there's a lot of exciting news for low-income countries as well. And the second news is that's something particular, of course, to the heart of Paris 21 and other partners, is lobbying the donors. And I think there is a lot of material in the report to showcase how we can make better investment in gender data capacity. One critical concern we have from Paris 21 is the number of donors supporting gender data in general is very low. It's not that many, in particular bilateral donors. We are very happy to have the Gates Foundation very much engaged, other philanthropic organizations like ULIT. But from the bilateral donor side, I'm afraid that we need more bilateral donors that also need to earmark some funding they give to gender equality, also to gender data. So I think that's something and requires a little bit of effort. And we can show, and I think what Uma was saying, many countries are now looking, particularly the bilateral donors, are looking for results frameworks. They want to see, is their tax money well spent? And now we have the means and tools to help the donors to showcase results over time, which is really an advancement. And then, of course, also, and I will close with this, is about the domestic resource mobilization. It has been said, we have in the report, there are some concrete examples of how this can be done. There are concrete examples in the qualitative analysis of how you can make how you can advance, which gives a lot of space for countries to improve gender data capacity and resist gender equality. So let me close by saying thank you to all of you. This is the beginning. We have more to come. Watch out for the World Data Forum and the full report launch. And yeah, thank you very much. And I believe I can close here and say wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and see you soon. Thank you very much.